church planting should be as McGavran said, should be the fruit and the outcome of healthy disciples who are reproducing. If I could be the czar of the church of the U.S. right now, I would actually abolish the word discipleship. It's not in the Bible. It's not a word you find in the Bible. Disciple making is the word. Make disciples, disciple making. The action verb part of it, of actually making disciples, is what we would be going after.
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Well, hello and welcome once again to the Mission Matters podcast. I am Matthew Ellison, and I am joined by my good friend and co-host, Ted Esler. Ted, what's up, brother?
Hey, I'm looking forward to this interview. When I got Todd's book, I actually just read it almost in one straight shot and really enjoyed it. So it's going to be a good interview.
Yeah, I think you sent me an email immediately afterwards and said, we have to have this guy on the podcast.
Yeah. So, Todd, let me just, I'm going to jump right in here.
Yeah.
We need to intro you, and I think it's better to ask guests to intro themselves. So could you just give us a couple of sentences about who you are and why you are uniquely qualified to write this particular book? Because I think you are.
Well, I am. I'm married to Anna. I have two boys, live in the Nashville area. I've now had more years in full-time vocational ministry than I did in the marketplace. I am a nuclear engineer by trade. I spent about 15 years as an engineer. I went into ministry kicking and screaming. And as we'll probably talk about a little bit in this book, I am a little bit like a Where's Waldo on the pages of the history book of the church growth movement. I did not become a Christian until I was an adult. One of the first memories I have of church was my mom dragging me to this church that started meeting in a movie theater called Willow Creek. And so I went to Willow Creek when it was in a movie theater. I used to ride my mini bike on the 90 acres of land that they ended up building their building on, and remember going through as a teenager, this must be a cult that's moving to this place. And so from an early age, the influence that the megachurch had on me, my family was the ideal seeker avatar in the Chicagoland area that Hybels was after. So I had not just a front row seat to it, but was reached by the seeker-sensitive movement. So it's a little bit bittersweet, the idea of, there's a lot to celebrate in that, and yet there's a lot that we need to get over in that. In my call to full-time ministry, a guy named Bob Buford, who was the founder of Leadership Network had a profound impact on the last part of the megachurch movement and a lot that's happened since then. His book, Halftime, had a significant influence on me in going from marketplace into ministry. By God's grace, I ended up meeting him accidentally when I got into full-time ministry. We were very kindred spirits. I had never met somebody I was so compatible with. Became Bob's personal strategic advisor for the rest of his life for about 15 more years after we met. About that time that I met him and had the front row seat to what Leadership Network was doing, I was starting a number of different national ministries and consolidated them around one called Exponential, which was became one of the larger church planting advocacy ministries in the world. And so the combination of my own personal experience in the seeker movement, my calling to ministry in the megachurch movement, my work with Bob Buford for 15 years, my founding and being the founding CEO of Exponential for 18 years and watching the whole transition of what happened up to almost present day is probably what you're talking about, giving me some qualifications for what's happened over the last 55 years.
Yeah. And the book's title is
How Did We Get Here? Looking Back to Look Forward. It also has a subtitle, Examining 75 Years of the Modern Church Growth Movement. But it's the idea that we really do need to look back and understand how we got where we are if we're going to overcome what I call the consumer-driven operating system in the future.
So, Todd, we're going to jump right into the deep end of the pool here. that's okay with you.
Ready to go.
You highlight that. All right. You highlight that Donald McGavran's original 1955 missionary principles were focused on gospel saturation, church multiplication, rather than building massive localized institutions. So how did this original missiological agenda shift into what you call the modern Americanized church growth model?
Yeah. Wow, we need a couple hours to get through that whole thing. So I'm going to succinctly try to give what you're asking is, and one of the integrated theses of the book is that there's been a co-opting of Donald McGavran's original ideals. I'm intentional with the word co-opting because when you look at what has happened, they say you can boil a frog in cold water just by turning the heat up over time. And I think that's sort of what's happened. There was no mischievous, let's deviate from McGavran. There was no, let's intentionally go do it different. I think you have for over 50 years, well-intentioned, I'm going to say apostolic, evangelistic, pioneering type leaders who really are driven by the evangelistic zeal to reach people. And I think the timing of the growth of suburbia, mass media, marketing, the timing was perfect for the seeker-sensitive approach to land on top of what McGavran was doing when he brought his missionary ideals and values and was the founding dean of the Fuller School of World Missions. And you just had this gradual co-opting. The best way I can describe it succinctly is where McGavran had a scorecard that was more about the Big C church. It was about church planting. It was about reaching lost people, gospel saturation. Subtly over time, the scorecard shifted through the seeker movement to winning is getting as many people converted as possible. Mm-hmm. And on Rick Warren's purpose-driven baseball diamond, it's that whoever gets the most people to first base wins. And so the holistic disciple making that will end up producing disciples who make disciples that plant churches, which is how I would summarize the core of McGavran. Disciples who make disciples that plant churches. And we muted that by shifting from disciples making disciples as our growth engine and reproduction to institutional programs, marketing, outreach, great Sunday services. And this is where the co-opting happens. All well-intentioned for reaching more people, but subtly the scorecard shifts to large. So you've got McGavran who planted 15 churches in his lifetime, none of which were over 100 people, as sort of the father of the modern church growth movement where the scorecard is large.
So a couple of thoughts or a couple of things in the book that jumped out to me. One, you noted that McGavran didn't even start this at Fuller until he was it 67 years old? Is that right?
That's right.
So for you underachievers out there that are under 67 years old, there's plenty of runway left to do something like McGavran did.
Yeah. I'm 62. And when he came off the mission field with the idea of starting a church growth institute that would equip international missionaries, what he wanted to do was find a place that he could start an institute. And while missionaries were on furlough at home, he could do equipping of them with what he's learned in his church growth principles to then send them back on the mission field. And so it wasn't originally Fuller. In the early 60s, he actually started the institute out in the Pacific Northwest at a small Bible college. And so he's 61 or 62 years old. And he's like today eligible for early retirement when he's actually getting this all started. And he spends his first 4 or 5 years just working it, not a lot of traction, and then got selected to come be the founding dean at Fuller with the condition that he bring the Church Growth Institute with him. And so now at age 67, he's literally in a second career when he's starting everything we're talking about.
Well, so I'm a Fuller grad. There no longer is a School of Intercultural Studies at Fuller. They folded that into the theology department. And so, in this time frame, that became like the most influential mission school out there and then folded. And that's, I think, somewhat connected to your story here, even though I know that's not a topic you go into in great detail. Talk a little bit about some of you got 12 interconnected dilemmas. You don't have to go into all 12, but the flywheel of constraint, locking existing churches into a system focused on addition over multiplication. What are some of the things that keep churches just focused on this idea of growth like this?
Well, if we want to call it a flywheel of growth, when the scorecard is large, it really, if you want to get your hands around the core, it's the principle of follow the money. The more people we reach and the bigger the church gets, the bigger the budget, the more programmatic activity we can do, the bigger the buildings we can build, the more services we can have, the more sites we can do, which is the more people then we can reach. And the more people we reach, the more money we bring in. And it's very much a flywheel of funding that the growth itself, while on one hand, yes, let's reach more lost people, but in reality, the growth is what fuels the programmatic engine that gives the growth. And what ends up happening is we don't have to make disciples to grow megachurches. You don't even have to be a Christian to lead and grow a megachurch. It's a formulaic institutional program that has an embedded growth engine with a monetary flywheel to it. And I don't want to, dismiss the fact that there's going to be a lot of people in heaven because of it. But the dilemma is this: programs never reproduce. At the core of McGavran's principle, disciples who make disciples who reproduce themselves in others, who plant churches that plant churches that reproduce. So reproduction is at the core of how McGavran wanted to add, how Jesus added, was disciples who make disciples that plant churches that plant churches. But when your growth engine becomes programmatic, fueled by money, there's never been a program in the history of the world that reproduces itself. Programs don't reproduce, they consume. What do they consume? Money and volunteers. And when money and volunteers become the fuel of your growth engine, and you don't need disciple making as part of what you're doing, it takes us down a bad path.
So, Todd, I'm going to throw something out here that I've heard over the years, and that is discipleship happens from the pulpit. And I've heard this mantra in megachurches a lot, and Sunday's game day.
Yeah.
Get ready for game day. This is where it all happens. And yet the human interaction, the life-on-life elements are just lacking. Yeah, they have small groups, but by and large, they're rehearsing the message that was on Sunday. So I know that the pulpit's important. Obviously, it lays a biblical foundation. But where does the real action happen in discipleship?
Yeah. The combination of the work on the book, and I need to answer this question. Let me back up even before the book ever was written. In my role at Exponential as the founding CEO there, we were nutty. I mean, our mission was to see church reproduction become a normative thing in the church. What does it look like for this idea of churches planting churches? And I'm going to say when we came up with that, I wasn't latched onto the disciple making part yet, I'll confess. We were focused on churches planting churches that plant churches. And how do we get that normative? And normative means sociologists say if you can get any kind of behavior of a population to at least 16%, you're at a tipping point where that behavior becomes normative for everybody. Less than 7% of U.S. churches ever reproduce. So 93% of churches don't reproduce, meaning reproduction is not a normative thing for the U.S. church. And so for many years, we were focused on, we've got to get this reproduction thing going. It was around 2014 or 15. Every year, I would take a couple of weeks to say, how are we doing? How close are we on the mission? Are we making progress? And it was around 2014 or 2015 that it really hit me like a lead brick that, oh my goodness, we don't have a church planting problem. We have a disciple making problem.
Mm-hmm.
Church planting should be as McGavran said, should be the fruit and the outcome of healthy disciples who are reproducing. So the disciple making part of this, and where's the action in it? I'm gonna go into the opinion mode right now, but I think it's right. Okay. But I'm gonna
go for it.
So if I could be the czar of the church of the US right now, I would actually abolish the word discipleship. It's not in the Bible. It's not a word you find in the Bible. Disciple making is the word. Make disciples, disciple making. The action verb part of it, of actually making disciples, is what we would be going after. And so your question, for those that see discipleship as the thing from the pulpit, I'm a co-founder of a ministry called Discipleship.org, which functions a lot like Exponential, a national ministry in the U.S. And we did a national study about 5 years ago that found that less than 4% of U.S. churches have a culture of disciple making. Now, less than 7% of churches are reproducing, and it should not surprise us that with less than 4% of U.S. churches having a culture of disciple making, that we wouldn't be far off from that of how many churches are actually reproducing. There's a direct connection between the two. But when you dig into the study that found that, and it was a national study that found that less than 4% of churches have a disciple-making culture, one of the top, there were 5 significant findings. One of them was that the word discipleship means so many different things to different people. If you ask a pastor, how are you guys doing on disciple making and discipleship? A pastor will think that he personally, on average, is spending over 30 hours a week in disciple making. And when you start to peel back and say, well, what are you counting in that? Well, if you're doing a planning meeting for an outreach event, you can connect that to discipleship. If you're preparing your sermon, you can count your 30 hours of sermon prep as disciple making. If you go down the list of all the things that a pastor sees through the lens of that's disciple making. And at the end of the day, you can add up 30, 35 hours a week that they're counting that way without ever a single bit of intentional relational disciple making with another person, where it's just directly one person with another. So, opinion wise, I think this idea that discipleship happens from the pulpit, I don't want to dismiss it. Like, I think there's a part to it, but if the 3 of our lives depended on something significant happening in disciple making in our sphere of influence, in our churches we lead, that we participate in over the next year, we have to see something catalytic happen with disciples making disciples who make disciples that plant churches. We're not spending much time at all on sermon prep and sermons and big group gatherings like that. We are going after a simple, reproducible, just like you teach your missionaries on the internet. We got to do something simple, reproducible that a 9th grader can do, and that it can be reproducible with simple language. That was another one of the findings, is that the language matters, and words mean different things to different people. And, even just getting into a common language is important.
Yeah. I mean, I know you're not deep into missiology and what's happening on a global basis necessarily, but there's been a huge shift toward disciple-making movements, the DMM models, on a global basis. There are serious detractors in the U.S. They think that model is not producing real churches. And I do think that this idea that it's, disciples, you disciple toward church planting, is what the DMM group has introduced, whereas the more traditional model would be you plant a church and inside that disciples are created. That definitely is a discussion and a debate inside global missions today.
Oh, it will absolutely increasingly be a conversation with where things are going to go in the U.S. I mean, it's the issue of, I mean, some people don't like to use the word minimum, but whether you want to say ecclesiology or minimum ecclesiology, and what's the difference between an everyday missionary in a mission field versus a church planter with a church, and where do you draw the line and how do you get there? For me personally, and I mean, I did a lot of work at this at Exponential, and we have some resources on it actually there. I personally, again, opinion, I don't want to stand before Jesus someday and have him say, why were you so stinking legalistic about what you were calling a church? And I also don't want him to say, wait a second, the church needs to be a healthy, functioning family that models healthy, functioning family. Why didn't you take it more seriously? So I think this balancing act between where on one end of the spectrum, somebody will say, well, wherever two or more are gathered, you have a church. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got so many hurdles to go through to get to where somebody's got to be ordained with 7 years of training and all kinds of things to ever get to officially calling something a church. And at the end of the day, we shouldn't miss the funk. Why is it important that every man, woman, and child have a healthy, functioning family called a church? And I just think we've got to be careful not to set the bar too low or too high.
So you cover this in your book a bit, but some might say, well, that was the missional movement. They were trying to bring a sense of mission back into the local church. I think looking back at that, I would say that didn't really work too well.
It was one of the more fascinating parts of the study I did in putting this book together. So I came into full-time ministry in the 98 to 2000 window. I had landed in full-time ministry in 2000. In retrospect, I did not understand the significance of what was going on in the 95 to 2005 window. And so let me give you one kind of glimpse. So Leadership Network that we talked about earlier, in 1995, if you look what was happening in 95, Leadership Network was running one of the few leadership conferences in America. The idea of leadership was a new thing. People don't realize it, but leadership's an invention of the last 30 years, the way we do it. Before, it used to be management and stewardship, and literally the leadership sector gets invented in the 85 to 95 window. You couldn't get a degree in leadership until the early 90s. Didn't even exist.
Yeah, it's true.
The number of publications on leadership from 1900 to 1985, hardly any. And all of a sudden from 85 to 95, there's more publications in a 10-year time period than there had been in the previous 90 years. So you've got, going into the 90s, you've got this sort of fascination with leadership. I think in the church in the U.S., part of that was because of the large church phenomena. You've got, all of a sudden, churches are growing really big. We've gone from less than 50 megachurches to thousands. Mm-hmm. Pastors are now CEOs. They've got to have COOs in the form of executive pastors. So you've got this whole dynamic that mega churches are emerging and growing, and many more of them. The leadership space is coming in. Rick Warren publishes The Purpose-Driven Church after a few years of going after that. Many, many churches get planted on that model. That institutionalizes a lot of the approach of the mega church right as we're coming into the 95 window. And if you look generationally, you've got, it's kind of fascinating. You've got several key leaders like McGavran, Peter Drucker, Schuler, Bob Buford, who are prior to boomers, and they set the stage for boomers to build the megachurch movement. And now you've got a megachurch movement that's built by boomers. And by 1995, Gen Xers in church are they're right at the age where they haven't yet started taking over. They're youth pastors, they're different things. And they're going to now start becoming the generation that takes over from boomers. And so Leadership Network kept hearing from megachurch pastors, what's your top issue? And the top issue was, how are we going to mobilize the next generation of leaders, these Gen Xers? So Leadership Network identified what they call a Young Leaders Initiative. And they went after Gen Xers who were going to end up planting churches, but hadn't yet done it. So you've got people like Mark Driscoll before he planted, Dan Kimball before he planted, Chris C. before he planted. You've got a group of about John Burke. You've got a group of about 20 Gen Xers. And if you think what's about to happen, are they going to inherit the megachurch model with its consumer-driven operating system and take it over and operate it to the next level? Or are they going to try to do something different? What brought that group together, and it's fascinating, I interviewed as many of that group of young leaders as I could. They met from 95 to about 2002. And every one of them I interviewed said that what brought them together and they rallied around was Leslie Newbegin's writing on the missionary impulse of how do you reach the next generation. And what was driving them was, we want to honor our peers and what came before us, but we have to figure out how to plant churches that reach a postmodern age. And so they were taking a missional posture to it. And I'm going to jump into opinion mode now. You did have a fracturing coming out of that. The emergent church movement came out of that, with some of those leaders going the emergent direction. And at Exponential at this point, around 2005, one of the top things we had going on was missional. Like all the tracks we would do at Exponential, missional was ramping up the interest in it. And that's driven by Gen Xers who are going to be taken over wanting to do something different. Opinion, I think the consumer-driven system is so deeply rooted in what we do that it overcame, it never got the full traction of a new thing. It just sort of, I think we succumbed to the consumer-driven mega model. Now here we are again. Boomers and Gen Xers are now the gatekeepers of the U.S. church. If you really go look, they're the gatekeepers now. And the system is this consumer-driven system that evolved off of McGavran's original teachings. Now we've got a next generation coming in. And the question is, are they going to embrace something new, or are they just going to take over this consumer-driven system? I'm on the fence right now. There's a lot of optimism. Let me tell you what I'm not on the fence about. Evangelicalism is broken. I don't think it's recoverable. And the consumer-driven operating system is dying. Something else is going to come. The question is the timing and whether it's this next generation that's going to be the pioneers of it.
Todd, let's build on that. How do you coach a veteran boomer or Gen X leader to genuinely pass the torch to younger generations without adopting this broken system?
Yeah, it's interesting, Matthew. I'm a futurist. I can't believe I spent 2 years writing a history book. Like, I was so ready to be done with it.
That's how you know the future is the history, right?
Well, and so my original intent, the title, How Did We Get Here? Looking Back to Look Forward. My intent was half the book is looking back and half the book's looking forward. If you would have told me I was going to end up writing 28 chapters of history and 1 chapter of looking forward, I wouldn't have had the energy to write the book. But it needed to be written. We need the history, because it is the understanding of the history that is going to help us overcome this ornery system that we have. And so Robert Lewis is a personal mentor. Robert was one of the, I'd call him fathers of the megachurch movement. He was in Little Rock, Arkansas at Fellowship Bible Church. Robert did the forward on the book and coached me through the 2 years. He helped me keep moving. And about 2/3 of the way through the book, Robert challenged me with, Todd, you got to back off on the future part, get the history captured. And he said, here's the deal. You can't tell the next generation what the future is. You can't create the playbook for the next generation. The best thing that us boomers and Gen Xers can do is encouragement, permission, figuring out the accountability thing, but letting the next generation write the playbook. He said, you need to err on the side of not giving what you think the future is, not giving what the roadmap is. And so if I make it personal, I'm a boomer. I'm at the end of the boomer side. And for me personally, I constantly, multiple times a week, somebody younger wants to talk to me to get advice on how to do something. And I'm doing my level best. I'm really trying not to tell somebody else how to do something. It's, how do you think this ought to be? Well, how would you do it? And I think subtly, us boomers have to get out of prescriptive building mode. We have to be, Bob Buford used to say, Home Depot's motto was, you can do it, we can help. You can do it, we can help. The church's motto and boomers' mottos who built it is, we can do it, you can help. There is a significant difference between we can do it, you can help, and you can do it, how can I help? And that's what boomers need to shift their posture from. It's got to shift from, I've been the one in charge, I know how this is, I know how to build it, to wait a minute, you have to be the one to do this. Now, how can I help you? And I think boomers need to get into that mentoring posture. And I think Gen Xers, because they are that right now, Gen Xers are the gatekeepers of the church. They get to decide where you release and where you don't. They've got it more challenging than the boomers right now. There's something as you age and you get older and you want to get into that mentoring mode. But when you're the Gen Xer and you're still the king, you don't want to let go of the reins. So it's going to take some modeling, some surrender. It's going to take some prominent Gen Xers who start to really model this in a way for the next generation. And in some ways, that's to the millennials too. You've got some boomers who have passed the torch directly from boomer to millennial. So we're increasingly are seeing millennials in charge of this current system. But I would say it's still the Gen Xers that have it. And I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but the answer is going to be found in, we've got to let go. It's how do we change that posture to do. Now, at the same time, when I said I have mixed emotions, that's the part that I'm 100% behind. We got to do that. Like, I don't have any doubt we got to do that. The flip side to that is the accountability part. It's, well, is it a blank check? Is it, if I can just be candid, the fracturing of evangelicalism, the erosion of theology in networks and denominations, I'm concerned that this spirituality and just releasing the next generation, let's just make sure we don't end up with a new age movement of some kind, or, something that's not solidly, Christian. And I think how we guide and help making sure that part of the accountability there is what I worry a little bit more about.
So give our listeners, when you look forward, put on your futurist hat here. What do you see? I mean, is the megachurch just gonna? I can't see it evaporate. If anything, I keep getting these reports about how there's more and more of them. And where are we headed here? Any idea?
Yeah. Well, again, I'm not going to claim to be prophetic on it. I think if you just look at what's happening, there's certainly, coming out of COVID the last 5 years, there's been a consolidation. I talked to many megachurch pastors over the last few years that much of their growth was transfer from smaller churches, coming out of COVID thing. I don't see the megachurch just going away overnight. I mean, I don't think it goes away overnight. I believe we've increasingly got to not see it as the future. If I were a betting person and I've got to bet on the future, it's going to be bivocational, co-vocational. It's going to be micro it's not going to be programmatically driven. It's going to be cut across the domains of society where church isn't so separate. It's going to be marketplace driven with a lot of everyday. If I can say everyday disciple making missionaries with their mission field, the very thing you all are passionate about internationally, the future is going to be the nooks and crannies of the U.S. are mission fields that everyday disciple making missionaries penetrate. Now, what does it look like to mobilize armies of everyday disciple making missionaries? If I'm predicting, it's not the megachurch doing it. So I think we can talk about what is it not. We still have to discover what it is. I don't think it's going to be I know it's not going to be the consumer driven operating system that fuels the large church phenomenon.
Yeah. Todd, we started off this podcast before we hit the record button, and you said that, I'm not the missions guy. But I think the implications of this in the missions world are significant. A lot of the ways we measure missionary and missions effectiveness is numbers driven. You have these boards of directors, and sometimes they're not viewing ministry through a spiritual lens. They're using their business metrics. This is what success looks like. And I know many missions organizations that's struggling. You want the businessman, you want the business acumen, you need to run the operation, well, all those things. But the measurements are not the right measurements. So let me just ask this as we prepare to wrap this up here. What are we measuring? I mean, not only in terms of church, but, planting churches. What types of things do we measure?
So, Matthew, before we let him answer, when I asked him about where things are going, I thought his answer was going to be, we have to measure different things.
No kidding.
But I also noticed in the book, I was looking for a discussion about measurement, because to me, that would be at the core of what's kind of broken here. It's an excellent question. Todd, what do you think?
Yeah. So, I need to just back up a minute. So I wasn't writing this book when I started writing. I was actually writing a book on the operating system itself, dissecting the operating system of the U.S. church, this thing I call the consumer-driven system. I identified 12 different very specific factors that give us the consumer-driven operating system. At the core is the scorecard. It starts with the core scorecard of how we measure success. And the way we measure success then gives us all the other dilemmas, these other 12 things. Mm-hmm. And so I literally started writing on these 12 dilemmas that we've got the wrong scorecard, and got through 5 of the 12, I think it was. And it was feeling, I love the local church. I'm a local church guy, but it was feeling really heavy, like deconstruction heavy. And I'm like becoming more and more convicted. We've got the wrong scorecard. We have to change. And the book's feeling heavy. And I said, I need to write a chapter on the history of the modern church growth movement to stick in the middle of this book, to celebrate and have something positive to say. And here I am, a student of I'm a product of the church growth movement. I didn't realize the McGavran part connected to seeker sensitive, connected to purpose driven, and the evolution of all that. And the co-opting really was of the scorecard. It's now the scorecard impacts the models and the methods, but it's a co-opting of scorecard. So however you want to fit this in on scorecard, I believe that the first dilemma that gets us in trouble is what I call the dilemma of endgame, or the dilemma of legacy. If a church gets 30 years, and most churches don't live more than 30 years, what's the goal in 30 years? Like, what is it to become a big, large, growing church? And we've got to get back to a scorecard of gospel saturation. Instead of how do we grow one big thing, what is our contribution to gospel saturation in a geography? And if Todd Wilson's measuring, I'm starting with, it's hard to say how do you measure gospel saturation, but what I can measure is what would have to be happening and what do I have to be doing to get gospel saturation? The part that I can influence. I can influence my growth engine, that it's disciples making disciples and not programs. So I'm not measuring butts in seats and how many buildings I have and I'm measuring how many people are in generational disciple making relationships. Generational mean disciples who are making disciples. And I'm counting how many people are in those relationships actively. I'm counting mobilize. If I'm going to get into the cracks and crevices with everyday disciple making missionaries for gospel saturation, I've got to have a measure of where we're penetrating. Like, where are we mobilizing everyday missionaries? And how many different places across the domains of society are we getting into? And I'm celebrating those things with stories. And so I'm definitely building a lot of my focus around the disciple making piece and the mobilization piece. And the things that are going to, if wildly successful, lead to my contribution to gospel, my church's contribution to gospel saturation in a geography.
Well, I wish we had more time. In the mission space, this generational counting with the movement folks, I've seen the charts on the walls and all this kind of business. It's got its own set of issues. Of course, everything does. Mm-hmm. But I do love the emphasis on disciple making. And I do think that's a big, significant part of this conversation. I just would also note, you got McGavran, you got Newbigin, two missionaries that came home and had huge influences on our church mentalities here. And I think we often think in terms of us as Americans inappropriately spreading our influence globally, but it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
We're also influenced back here.
It's interesting, Ted, that as I understand it, when McGavran came off the mission field in the early 60s, it wasn't until 1970 when C. Peter Wagner had joined him at Fuller that they did their first class for U.S. pastors. McGavran was not, keen on how are we going to do this with U.S. pastors. He spent, 5-6+ years learning and trying to mobilize the international missionary part. And it was C. Peter Wagner who convinced him, let's do this with U.S. pastors.
Well, I just would say, if you haven't read this book, grab it. Yeah. And by the way you've released it online, the ability to query it with AI, et cetera, very innovative. What's the name of the website? People want to check it out?
Church-growth.org, church-growth.org. You can get the free summary of the book, the free PDF of the book, the free audio of the book, the free wiki of the book are all on the website. And for those that still like to read or get the Kindle, you can still get it on Amazon too. So,
yeah, well, kudos to you. Good job. Excellent book. And I think it's going to create a lot of very helpful conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it'd be fitting to end with the words of Jesus here. I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against her. And so it's a mystery. We don't get it, but he is building his church. We stumble, we bumble, we fall, we learn, we grow. But our future is bright. We're going to have that consummation in heaven, the wedding supper of the Lamb, and the bridegroom will receive his bride. So that's what we're going for. Todd, thank you so much, brother.
Thank you guys for having me. This has been fun.
Before you go, be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Esler, president of Missio Nexus.